I had the pleasure of meeting Tom and Laura McNeal last night, and I want to tell you both we are all grateful that two such distinguished authors made the trip all the way from San Diego, California to Gaithersburg. I think the best books crack open, reach two strong arms out, pull you in, and slam the covers shut. In the case of To Be Sung Underwater, the book that Tom McNeal has written, the arms don't let you out until the story has been told, and you are completely saturated by it. Even then, you just can't throw open the book's covers and leave. As the New York Times reviewer wrote of To Be Sung Underwater, Mr. McNeal's characters are full and knowable. His sentences are the strong, silent type, generous without being showy, and his novel is, quite simply, lovely. I give you Tom McNeal.
Now I don't know whether I need the, I don't really need the microphone, do I? Maybe I'll use it. Really nice of you to show up here today. The first book that I wrote was a book called Goodnight, Nebraska, which is basically about four characters who pretty much lose their way in a small town in Nebraska. And while I was writing that book, I think probably you all have read or at least know of Willa Cather, really a terrific writer. While I was writing Goodnight, Nebraska, I had a desk with a glass top, and under the glass I had a quote from H.L. Mencken, who said of Willa Cather, "I don't care how well she writes, I don't give a damn what happens in Nebraska." And there are a few people out there who kind of feel that way. So we'll tell you something about my commercial instincts that the next time I sat down to write, I went back to Nebraska. I also started thinking about an old friend of mine from high school. This is a guy named Bill Gerard, and he was a guy who taught me a lot without really meaning to teach me a lot. I have two sons, one of them about that guy's age, and one a couple of years older. And when they were younger and there was a parade, I'd put one or the other on my shoulders so they could see what was going on. In a way, Bill Gerard was the same kind of person for me. He allowed me to see things a little further and a little differently. He was a guy that nothing bothered him, nothing made him mad. He seemed to view everything that was going on as if it were provided for his own amusement. He was the first guy who said, that I heard say, "Screw them if they can't take a joke." And he would say it all the time. And that was his approach to things. Bill liked to hunt and to fish. He shot ducks and doves and he fished. And at that time, I was spending a lot of my summers in Nebraska. And I thought that Bill would be a perfect fit for Nebraska. So I tried to talk him into going back with me on one summer or another. That never worked out. Time went by. He and I went to different colleges. After college, I was doing graduate work at UC Irvine in Southern California. And Bill came down because he had fallen madly in love with a woman who was working in Southern California. So we all lived in a little ramshackle house on a bluff overlooking the ocean in Laguna Beach. And I had really never seen Bill as happy as he was during that period. About a year went by. He was fantastically happy. They were making long-term plans. And one day I came home from school, and Bill was out on the deck drinking a beer and staring off. And I knew immediately something was wrong. And there was. Candace, the girlfriend, had left, had gone. And most people recover from these things. But in a certain and important way, Bill never did. He went on, he married the best friend of the girl he had been madly in love with. He had 2 great kids. He made good money, but he had completely lost his kind of genial outlook, his way of addressing the world. He was just a changed guy. And he had always been a drinker. He drank more. As time went by, he understood that it was going to get him, and he still kept drinking. And toward the end of things, he knew that he wasn't going to last long. And the last time I saw him was in a restaurant, and he was there with a nurse, and we had this long lunch and good talk. And finally it was time to go, and I left first. And when I got to the door of the restaurant and looked back, Bill just had this incredibly radiant smile on his face. And it was like he had just caught a big fish. And it was also like I had never seen him in a long time. It was only a few months after that we had the memorial service, and this is up at the Rogue River. My wife was there, Laura, and we were, throwing the ashes out. And a lot of people talked about the effect he had had on their lives and anecdotes and that sort of thing. I am not a public speaker. That made big surprise there. I didn't speak, but if I had, it would have been to say something along the lines of that period of time when it felt as if he had me on his shoulders and let me see things a little bit differently. The great thing about writing fiction is you can change things. And so when I started writing this book, I knew that Bill Gerard was going to be the starting point for the character of Willie Blunt. But I also knew that I was going to give Willie Blunt a kinder and more introspective girlfriend than my friend actually did have. Basically, the story is it's a lifelong love story with about 25 years whacked out of the middle. And I think what I'm going to do is read a short section of the book. And the girlfriend I created for the Willie Blunt character is named Judith Toomey. And Willie has met Judith when she and her father came out to a farm to buy a used washing machine and dryer. And Willie and Judith had this kind of jousting, flirtatious conversation. But nothing after that really happened for about a year. Then they see each other again. It's in a Pizza Hut. This is in northwest Nebraska. And he asks for her telephone number, which she gives to him. That night he calls and asks her to have dinner with him. 2 things about the invitation. First of all, he says it will be just the 2 of them who will be dining. The other thing he says is that there will be that he will show her something that she has never seen before. So when we take up this passage, he has just driven her to a remote hilly area at the base of the Buttes, south of town, northwest Nebraska. Okay, I need my glasses for this. I kind of get Brazilian music in the background. As they stepped from the truck, they were greeted with assorted bird cries, all shrill and alarmed seeming, as if the intrusion of two humans was real news. Willie strapped on a backpack and carried the ice chest on his shoulder as he led the way up the incline and into the pines. The wind through the trees made a low, flutish sound that fell just short of music, and the mat of needles beneath her feet was surprisingly soft and slippery. In about 10 minutes' time, they were overlooking a kind of encampment, a cleared space of ground among the pines and ash. As they descended, a fire pit came into view, and a couple of aluminum and canvas camp chairs that were showing their age. There was also a crude, wide plank table with a plank bench on each side. The surfaces of both the table and the benches were clean. Kindling and small pieces of dry pine had already been laid in the rock fire pit. "You've been up here recently, I guess," Judith said. It didn't bother Willie to admit this. Had to do a little housekeeping is all. Didn't want you to find the place a mess. He set down the cooler and backpack and looked at her. "So tell me this, Judith Toomey. Is this your first date?" "No," Judith lied at once. "What made you think that?" "Well, I knew it was our first date, yours and mine, which made it important. At least to me it did. But I had the feeling it might be your first date, which might make it even more important. And I wanted it to be, just real nice." His mouth loosened again into a friendly grin, like somebody gave a good goddamn. "Sorry, Nick." He offered a bottle of beer to Judith, who thought she ought to refuse it, but didn't. To Judith Toomey, in the big surprise, he said mildly and gently clicked the neck of his bottle to hers. He busied himself gathering firewood while she sat at the table and sipped her beer and took the place in. The tall ponderosas and the soft carpet of pine needles, the crickets and cicadas and birds and low hollow sound of the wind. The birds seemed calmer now, as if the alarm had gone out of them, and it was again business as usual. She liked it that Willie could identify the bird calls, and she liked it that he knew the names of the butterflies, red admirals and painted ladies, morning cloaks and yellow swallowtails. "Soapweed," he said when she asked him what one yucca-like shrub was. "Cows love the stuff, blossoms, seed pods, roots too, if they can get at them. They'll just about run from one bush to another when they're set loose in a pasture with them." He grinned at her. "It's about the only time a cow can make you laugh." He pulled a red gingham cloth from his backpack and floated it over the plank table. Then he opened the bag of food. There were grilled sandwiches inside, pastrami and Swiss cheese on rye, and Judith never would have thought a grilled sandwich served cold could taste so good. When she looked up from her food, Willie was regarding her. "I've seen rodeo boys eat daintier than that," he said. He tore the last sandwich in two and presented both portions. She took the bigger one, and he said, "I knew it." The encampment was part of a large, beautiful, and, he said, agriculturally useless property owned by one of his mother's cousins. Willie harbored hopes of one day buying the land and building a cabin on it. While he and Judith finished off the last sandwich, he pointed to a draw where, with an earthen dam, a small lake might be formed. Judith could imagine it, the pine trees, the sky, the water, the bird calls, and flutish wind. "It'd be a beautiful place to swim," she said. "Or to fish. I was thinking of stocking it with rainbows and bass." Judith said, "Okay, I'll fish with you if you'll swim with me. Of course, you'd have to teach me to fish." He said, "Well, then, that'd make us even." "How's that?" "You'd have to teach me to swim." Judith came out with a real laugh. "You can't swim?" Willie shrugged complacently. The shadows of the trees and buttes had been stretching longer, and the light had all but drained from the sky. Willie put a match to the fire he'd already laid, and although the cool that came with the darkness had been refreshing at first, Judith was glad now for the heat. He brought over the two old camp chairs and set them up near the fire in locations that seemed important to him. "That one's yours," he said, pointing. They looked the same to Judith, so she said, "How come that one? Is it booby-trapped or something?" "Why, yes it is," he said. "What happens when you sit in that particular booby-trapped chair is that all your inhibitions explode, and you start dancing naked around the fire." She sat down in the chair and blinked at him. "Liar." He shook his head and pretended mystification. "Well, that was how it worked last time." For dessert, he'd brought graham crackers, chocolate bars, and marshmallows, and while the fire burned down, he whittled skewers from willow branches. Both he and Judith had the same marshmallow roasting technique, patiently keeping the marshmallows close, but not too close to the coals, so they skinned a mellow brown before being sandwiched with chocolate and graham cracker. These two tasted so good that Judith wondered if she'd fallen under some kind of spell. "Were those the surprise?" she said, "because if they were, I'd be more than satisfied." "No, that was just part of the dining package. Your big surprise is coming." "Coming when, exactly?" "In a little while, plus or minus." For the next half hour or so, they talked about anything that came to mind, just talking and listening and agreeing, always agreeing. Every now and then, Willie uncapped another bottle of beer or checked his pocket watch or fed wood to the fire. "Pine's poor for heat," he said, "but it's unbeatable for popping and crackling." When he went off to urinate or gather wood, he'd fall to whistling, and once, while he was off, Judith put her head back, closed her eyes, and listened to the sounds of the wind and the fire and the crickets and the frogs, and just beyond those, the man-made whistling of a song she couldn't quite name. She was a long way from anyone, in a place where nobody could see what she did or what he might do, a fact that ought to have made her cautious or fearful, but didn't. It made her feel a little excited. When Willie came back, he sat forward in his chair and began to whittle a new skewer. "For the next time you come," she said. He said, "To be truthful, I was thinking for the next time we come." "You're already planning ahead." "Oh, yeah, that's one of the things I do." "Me too." Willie whistled a few more notes from his song, then broke off and checked his watch and the sky. "Okay," he said, "time to get you ready." He was holding a red bandana at each end, twirling it into something vaguely ropey. "This goes over your eyes, but if you promise not to peek, I won't cinch it too tight." Judith looked at the bandana stretched between his hands. "You know, if something bad happens to me out here, my father will hunt you down and kill you." "Of course he would," Willie said. "What father wouldn't?" He laid the bandana over her eyes and tied it off. "That okay?" She nodded. "Okay, just sit back and relax." Relaxing implied waiting, which alarmed her. "What do you mean, relax?" "It'll be a minute or two. I'll tell you when." He began again to whistle, and she said, "What is that song, anyhow?" "Don't you like it?" "I like it, okay. It's just that I feel like I've heard it before, but can't name it." "Me either," he said. "It just always comes to me. It's one of my mother's old songs. Maybe sometime you can ask her." "If I live to meet her." "You're kind of funny," he said. He resumed whistling, and it soon seemed to Judith that she had drifted just beyond herself and was hovering there listening to the hollow wind in the trees. The hiss and crackle of the fire, the whistled song, and then abruptly the whistling stopped, and she couldn't hear Willie's breathing or feel his presence. And the other sounds that only moments ago had seemed comforting now seemed disquieting. "Willie?" He didn't answer. "Willie?" "Just a damn second," he said. "Okay, it's ready." The soft flannel of his shirt brushed her face as he unfastened the bandana. She had had her eyes closed behind the cloth and opened them. He was pointing toward the two closest buttes, which were now silhouetted in blackest black against some new and grand source of light. It was a brilliant, buttery yellow, and though it at first seemed stationary, it wasn't, for the light seemed to rise looming from the two buttes, and it gave them each the kind of aura that Judith associated with pictures of Jesus. But this soon changed too. The illumination slid slowly upward, growing larger, wider, whiter, casting its dazzling light, becoming its entire self, a flush, full moon, though she had to admit it. This was not the moon as she had ever known it. It was a different moon. There was the low, resonant wind through the trees and the crack and pop of the fire, and there was this moon, free now of the buttes, hanging huge and luminous behind a slim, filmy cloud. Judith took a deep breath so she could hold it all in. There, Willie said in a low voice, that right there is the moon to watch. Judith said, if anybody painted that moon exactly as it is, right now, right there, everybody would like it, but nobody would believe it. Not one person. They'd think you made it up. Willie said, maybe tomorrow we'll think we did too. She turned suddenly. No, she said with vehemence, we won't, because you saw it and I saw it. Willie was nodding and smiling. Of course, one of us might wake up somewhere down the line and begin doubting what we saw. Judith looked at him in the light of the moon and the fire. Then, and even during this moment, it felt like something from a movie she'd seen or would like to see. She rose and swung a leg over his leg and settled into his lap so they sat face to face. It's not going to be me, she said in a tight whisper. It's not going to be me who doubts it. What she had done and was doing was a surprise to herself, and his expression, too, seemed full of wonderment. He touched a single finger softly to her nose. Then he touched her eyelids closed and began smoothing the soft round of his finger across her lips. And just like that, she was kissing him, uncertainly at first and then greedily, teeth clashing with teeth. When his free hand slid up toward her bra clasp, she arched her back to make it easier, and the instant the clasp fell free, she felt herself breathe a different kind of air. When the time came to leave, he was the one to dump ice and water onto the fire and shovel dirt over the embers. He gathered the empty beer bottles and their other trash into the ice chest. During this time, Judith managed nothing more than standing, fastening her bra and buttoning her shirt. On the way home, once they'd bounced across the creek in rough terrain and were again on a graded road, she stared out at the moon, but it had already become the usual moon, distant, white, the one she'd known her entire life, until tonight. She turned and lay down with her head in Willie's lap. He drove slowly. She would find that he always drove slowly. Finally, she said, that was my first date, just so you know. Also my first kiss. He said, well, I hope you didn't find anything disappointing. She laughed and burrowed her face into his flannel shirt. And then, to her surprise, she was crying. Hey now, what's the matter? We didn't do anything you'd call extreme. This was true. They both kept their hands above the waist. That isn't it, she said. I just don't want it to end. Willie Blunt combed his fingers through Judith's hair. A rock plinked against the undercarriage. When he spoke, his tone had lost its customary looseness. I'm going to tell you something, he said. Then, the thing is, I think you're just a lot more interesting than any girl I've ever met. She snuffled and lifted her head and dabbed a tissue at her nose. You do? Yeah, I do. How come? He let out a low laugh, as if he hadn't expected that particular question. He glanced down at her, then back at the road. She had the impression he wasn't so much searching for an answer as waiting for it to come to him. Finally, he said, sometimes that's a hard thing to put your finger on. A few minutes later, Willie turned the Chevy truck from the graded road onto Highway 20. In the relative quiet, Judith said, will you come by tomorrow afternoon? And he touched his finger to her nose and said, why, of course he would. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer a question if anyone has a question to ask. Sure.
When did you start writing?
And the question is, when did I start writing? And I always loved to read. I always loved to write. And thinking in terms of the question as fiction, I think that probably would have been 5th or 6th grade. You know, I was doing things and illustrating in crayon. And then in high school, you know, I would write things that were closer to what you could call a story. And then kind of ever after. And it took me a long time to start writing things that got published. So yeah, started early, and I hope I can stay late.
Did you actually see that moon that you described in your book?
I saw the moon, but not from that particular perspective. So I can only say yes and no. I mean, I know where those buttes are and where it would have been seen. The line about that right there is the moon to watch comes from a cousin of mine who said that exact thing, and I wrote it down, and it's now in the book. I credit him at the back of the book, but yeah. Are you from that area?
No, I've only been to Omaha.
Yeah, it's kind of a different world, southeast and northwest Nebraska, but yeah. We've got a question from the young guy in the front. Yes. Why did I start writing? I think if you do love to read, you will want to try to write. And if you get some kind of positive reinforcement for that, you'll probably keep doing it. That's my guess. It's, why did you start playing baseball kind of question. I mean, if you like it, you do it. And then if you're any good at it, you keep doing it. Anyone else? Yes.
I read the book, and when I finished it, I was stared off into space for quite a while.
You know,
As your friend did. And I love it. And I closed it and thought, I'm going to read it again in 6 months. Because I realized that when you constructed nothing was wasted. And but I wanted some time. So that's 6 months.
I needed to hand that woman the microphone. She was simply saying that she did like the book. Thank you. When you put a book together, this book took 7 years to write. My wife and I also do young adult books, so there were other projects that came along, and I'm a partner in a business, and we've got 2 kids who are 12 and 14, as I mentioned. So there are other distractions. But as you write, when you say that it was a carefully constructed book, it may appear to be now, and I hope it does. But as you write, you don't really know. I mean, it's occurred to me, I had a vision of this book being somewhat different than it turned out to be. And somewhere along the line, in the 4th or 5th revision, I sort of recognized that what I thought was the book was more like the scaffolding that was allowing me to build the book, and I needed to get rid of the scaffolding. So revision, I don't know if any of you are teachers, but both Laura and I have taught school, and the revision process is such a key thing, and there are very few people who can write a book without the revision and have it turn out seeming as if it's been really put together. So, any other questions? Yes.
Talk a bit about your collaboration process.
So the question is, will I talk a bit about my collaboration process? And on our young adult books, are you going to run up and and grab the mic? Laura and I have written 4 books together, 5, including a picture book, and we're pretty careful about how we do it. But typically, one of us will write a chunk, we'll get things started, and then we'll turn that chunk over to the other, who will read and digest it. And if everything is working the way you hope it will, in a couple of months, the manuscript will come back to you with another 50 or 60 or 70 pages that you love, and you kind of feel like it was a long family vacation and you fell asleep, in Texas, and now you're in Louisiana or something, because it's a funny pleasure to be reading what is in effect, at least partially, your own book for the first time. You have to make some, I wouldn't say compromises, but by the time we're done, I often cannot remember who wrote what. So, especially when I come back to it much later. And you have to somehow do that, because it would feel pretty funny generally if it changed, if there's a real abrupt shift in tone or prose or diction or, really anything. So, in the end, it's worked out and been a lot of fun. Now, I have to say, Laura and I did 3 young adult books together. They did really quite well, and a couple of small prizes. She did a book by herself, excluding me, and it was nominated for the National Book Award. So she can do it on her own. And we are now more doing it on our own. I just finished one, and she's working on one. We both look at each other's work very carefully, and Laura's my first and best reader. But we're now kind of doing it on our own, but we're still married, so that's good. That's good. Okay, well, thank you very much. It's been fun.